Let us continue with myths and realities of the Venice Charter, which can lead sometimes to very different and various and misunderstandings. Therefore, Benedict Self-Law would like to share about and rely on the matter of can a different perspective on the intentions of some of the Charter's authors provide us with useful insights for heritage conservation today. Benedicte, good morning.
And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and apologize that I cannot be with you in Latvia, but I'm ill. Nevertheless, I'm delighted that I can be with you to trigger some discussions. Now, the idea of this lecture was triggered by my reaction to some statements that were made on the intentions of the drafters of the Venice Charter at the conference of the ICOMOS International Scientific Committee on Conservation and Philosophy in March this year. I was very much, I was taken aback by those statements. And I said that they would probably have been very surprised by the thinking that was attributed to them, and probably also even saddened. So my lecture is based on that little incident. And in the first part, I will try to debunk some of the myths around the Venice Charter using facts and text and recollections. In the second part, because I fear that the situation is quite hopeless, I will come back to the reality or realities in plural, even if I know that it's difficult to translate into Latvian. And in the last part, I will recall some tools that provide guidance for interpretation of the Venice Charter, but also for guidance on heritage projects or projects impacting on heritage. The teachings of Paul Philippot and Raymond Lemaire are the common thread for those three parts. And that explains also the subtitle of my lecture. The next slide, please. To the organizers, I don't see the slides moving on my screen, and actually I need that. Is it possible to... Hello?
On our side, slides are moving. We are on the one where after pictures of Philippot and Lemaire to the one with text written.
Yes, unfortunately, I see only the cover, and well, I will try to do it like that. If the technicians can work on it so that I see on my screen also the slides moving, that would be wonderful. So you see a picture with Paul Philippot and Raymond Lemaire. I knew him, Paul Philippot, when I was studying at the Center for Conservation of Historic Towns and Buildings at the Leuven University, as it was named at the time, and today it's the Raymond Lemaire International Center for Conservation. And the lectures of Paul Philippot were actually stunning. At the time of the Venice conference, he was deputy director of ICROM, and he later became ICROM's DG. And Raymond Lemaire, of course, I've known him as professor when I was studying at the Faculty of Engineers in Leuven. And also I had the privilege to work with him when I was at the European Commission, and he was chairing the jury of the pilot projects for conservation, and I was doing the pre-selection and the secretariat of the jury. So as students, we were very privileged because we did not go to lectures, but to the castle. And I can tell you that the high-rise building behind the castle did not exist in Lemaire's lifetime, and it still generates a lot of debate. The next slide, please, should show you the manuscripts Raymond Lemaire was the rapporteur of the drafting committee, and Paul Philippot is the author of the preamble. So you see their two handwritings. The next slide, please, recalls the aim of the Venice Charter to set the principles guiding conservation and restoration of monuments. So nothing more, but nothing less. I will come back to that. And in the next slide, you will see the participants, a photograph of some of the participants in Venice. To the right, you have somebody else who was a member of the drafting committee. It's Carlos Flores Marini from Mexico. And I would also like to draw the attention to the lady next to him. It's Ruth Rivera Marin, a very influential Mexican architect, a woman. There were not that many women at the time. And in Venice, she was designated as a member of the organizing committee that would prepare the establishment of ICOMOS. And she was also the only woman vice president of the Constituent Assembly and the first General Assembly in Poland in '65. You see also the cover of the publication, which was published by ICOMOS in 4 languages. And the next slide, please. You should see the inside of the brochure with the 4 columns with the 4 languages, English, Spanish, French, and Russian. I've used the brochure to illustrate the various points that I'm making in this lecture. And I will come back to the issue of translations later. You have to know that the drafts were made in French, like you saw in the handwritten notes, and that during the conference, there was a translation made into English by somebody from UNESCO, and the text was finalized after the conference and then retranslated and disseminated. Okay, time has come to the myths. The next slide, please. And to consider some of the statements made with much aplomb on the Venice Charter and on the drafters, and to check whether they're myths or reality. The next slide, please, is a very consistent myth is that the Venice Charter is a response to the widespread destruction after World War II. Do you agree or not? Myth or reality? Next slide, please. Well, actually, in my opinion, the question requires a nuanced response because, of course, it was the Venice Charter responded to widespread destructions, but it also was very needed reaction because of the destructions generated by the economic and social development after the war. And in some countries and regions, and not just in Western Europe, public and private works resulting from industrial development, urbanization, infrastructure and roads triggered actually more destructions than during the war itself. So it depends on where you are. And you can see a reference to those threats in UNESCO documents. And even it was one of the reasons why the World Heritage Convention was established. So it's no accident that the conservation movement was born in the 60s. And according to some of the people who were active at the time and were still alive, we are more or less back in that period. I wonder what you think about that. The takeaway here is that one has always to contextualize, and I'm actually curious to know what the situation in Latvia is. The next slide. Fashion may also be a reason. This is a reminder that in Venice there was just one resolution of motion adopted on a specific building. It was on the People's House of Horta in Brussels, and the participants asked the Belgian government to protect it. Of course, to no avail, the decision makers went ahead and built a banal high-rise office block, which is completely out of context. Today, of course, we would never, ever demolish a Horta building. So it was a short-sighted decision that disregarded experts' opinions and ignored the principle of precaution. Of course, it did not help that Horta style at the time was qualified as spaghetti style. And I have also to confess that the office block looks much better on the photograph than it really is. The next slide, please. That's also, let's say, a very strong statement that we hear all the time. The Venice Charter is a purely European product. Is it myth or reality, according to you? Next slide. Well, whatever today's perception or the strong statements made, for whatever reason, the purpose of the Venice Charter was undoubtedly to draft an international document, and the preamble could not be clearer. The last sentence that you see on the screen is also a clear invitation to take into account culture and traditions from all over the world, and it's paved the way for the Nara Declaration. So the Venice conference was undoubtedly an international conference with participants coming from all over the world, even if the majority came from Europe. And there was a clear shift with the Athens conference from 31 and the Paris Congress from 57, as Claudine Houdard demonstrated with her maps. I mentioned already that the charter was translated in 4 languages and widely disseminated. And also, ICOMOS was, let's say, there was a call to create an ICOMOS with national committees. And I'm a witness that as founding fathers of the organization, Getzola and Raymond Lemaire spared no effort towards the creation of such committees in all over the world, because learning from each other and sharing experiences was considered a key of key importance, and it still is. So the next slide, please. The Venice Charter is only about major monuments, myth or reality? Next slide. Well, we will not spend much time about it because the answer is very clear in Article 1 of the definitions. I've added the text in Latvian. I hope that I did not make mistakes in copy-paste because I'm completely lost by your beautiful language. What I would like to stress here is that selective reading or forgetfulness is really a problem when we interpret documents. And sorry, I've not added a slide asking whether the historic urban landscape approach is new, but it's clear from the definitions that it is not. And actually, when I was studying in Leuven, we were already thought on how to implement it. Next slide, please. That's a big one. The authors of the Venice Charter considered heritage as objects that were static and just tangible. Myth or reality? Next slide, please. Well, the Venice Charter does not just refer to objects. It uses the term historic monuments rather than the term heritage, which we use today. However, the definition in Article 1 that we just saw embraces the living environment of people. And this is further underscored in Article 5, indicated that conservation is made easier when monuments have a useful function in society. Now, monuments and settings are not considered as static. In the Charter, if you read it carefully, First of all, they are often the result of a long evolution with layers of different periods, like Article 12 recalls. And the Charter also recognizes the changing nature of monuments and their settings. And it's precisely for that reason that it provides guidance, not only on how to conserve and restore, to transmit the heritage to future generations, but also on how to handle changes due to evolving needs and uses, and how to respond with a design that does not negatively impact the heritage. And this guidance is set out in the sections on conservation and restoration. And finally, there is the conceived idea that the Venice Charter and heritage preservation in Europe is only dealing with material aspects. Now, there's only one single reference in the Venice Charter to original material substance, and that's in Article 9. Those who focus on the material aspects only, in fact, are ignoring all the other references in the Charter, which refers to the values, to the call for multidisciplinarity, the considerations that monuments are historic documents, testimonies, and so on. But it's true that we don't use the same words today. We have another jargon, and that probably may have contributed to misunderstandings. But what is, for me, very, very clear is that Raymond Lemaire and Paul Philippot, that for them, tangible and intangible aspects were inseparable. And I think we can all agree that that's the case. In their teachings, they underscored the importance of intangible aspects, of values, of meanings. And their aim was to make students aware, not only on that, but how design solutions or sometimes maintenance can have an impact on the perception and the way we enjoy or not heritage, and how it can impact the meaning and the significance, and more general, the quality of our living heritage. And one of the examples given by Paul Philippot is shown on the screen. It's the golden churches in Lisbon, with the undesired effect of harsh lighting or the spots. It was not at all meant to be that, and it impacts the heritage and let's say with the enjoyment and the intangible values of the heritage. Same, for instance, for over polishing floors and turning them into mirrors when that's not the purpose. A takeaway from this is that the Charter has to be considered in its totality, and that fragments cannot be taken out of context. The next slide is the statement that the Venice Charter is not people-centered, myth or reality. Next slide. Here, a nuanced response is required. The objective was very specific, and in fact, the Venice Charter is not a Swiss Army knife. But I can tell you that the humanists were, the drafters were humanists and paid great attention to quality life environment for the people, because they knew that well-being depended upon it. And by the way, Gazzola and Raymond Lemaire were influential in developing the people-centered conservation concepts, like the concept of integrated conservation of the Council of Europe, adopted in 1975. I also wanted to mention here that as heritage professionals, we have our own jargon. And it was only recently that ICOMOS started to adopt the jargon of other related domains, like, for instance, in risk prevention or climate change or human rights, because if we do so, we can have a better dialogue with those related fields and make sure that they also take heritage conservation into account. So it's true that the Venice Charter, as I mentioned before, had a limited scope. And so the intention was not to turn it into a Swiss Army knife. Now we come to the realities. Next slide, please. The Venice Charter is not written in stone. Next slide, please. Well, actually, there was an amended version of the Charter, but it was withdrawn by Raymond Lemaire himself at the ECOWAS General Assembly in Moscow. The next slide, please. Now, it's a pity in a way, because the proposed amendments were the result of a very long consultation process. But Lemaire withdrew the proposal because he noted that there was no consensus on the revised text, in contrast to the general enthusiasm felt in '64. It was pointless, in his opinion, to replace a consensual text by a text that was not fully adhered to. And the question is, was there really a consensus in '64 or just the smell of a consensus? Yes. However, it's useful to say that the most significant change was to replace monuments by monuments and sites, and that there were 5 additional articles on ensembles and sites. The mayor was strongly in favor of the amended text and shared it with his students, and that's why that you see my copy from the time I was a student on the screen. Luckily, the work was not completely lost, because subsequently there came other charges on historic gardens and historic towns. Next slide, please. There is a plurality of Venice charters because of the divergent and officially distributed translations. Next slide. This is a major example of the difference in translations linked to the very structure of the charter. It's conservation versus restoration. You see the first sentence of Article 4. You see it in French, the original version, Latvian, English, but also a new translation by Diebel in English. And then you see the same for Article 9. And here you see that Article 9 in English and in French is completely different. Restoration should be an operation that is exceptional. It should remain exceptional. Now, I don't understand Latvian, but I have the impression that it is closer to the English, you will tell. Next slide, please. So, because of those translations, but also given the countless studies and opinions, there are numerous interpretations and ways to implement. So myths will not be debunked, but does the Venice Charter still trigger reflections to guide the project and its design? Next slide. Here you see some examples. With on the left, a church, an abandoned chateau turned into an architect's office. And you see the microwave at a very sacred place. And the port building in Antwerp by Zaha Hadid. So let's look now at the guidance, the last part of my lecture. What guidance do we have to interpret the Venice Charter? And is there any other guidance? Next slide, please. Well, the first tool is the Vienna Convention, and in particular, the Articles 31 to 33 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties on Interpretation of International Text. Next slide, please. The general principle for interpretation is that a treaty is interpreted in good faith, in accordance to the ordinary meaning to be given to the terms of a treaty, in their context, and in the light of the object and purpose. So all terms are very important here. Good faith, loyalty and respect, and faithfulness for those who will take action. The ordinary meaning of terms means that one needs to find out what the definition of the words is, and that a particular meaning can only be given if that was the intention. A context that's further developed in paragraph 2 and 3 of this article 33 of the Vienna Convention. A text must never be extracted or separated from its context. And the context includes the preamble, and there may be a need also to consider the preparatory text or subsequent practice to implement a treaty. And finally, object and purpose is very important, because if not, a treaty is pointless. Now, obviously, the Venice Charter is not an international treaty, but just a charter by, let's say, adopted by heritage professionals. But nevertheless, those principles can be very useful. And we have already seen that very often interpretations are the results of things taken out of context. Next slide, please. The treaty also provides some guidance on translations. And in fact, sorry. Actually, the terms of a treaty are presumed to have the same meaning in each authentic text. Now, were there authentic texts or not? It's true that there were 4 versions that were officially distributed, and then the other point is that when the comparison of the authentic text discloses a difference in meaning, and the treaty does not mention the linguistic version that prevails, one should turn to Article 31 and Article 32 to eliminate the difference in meaning. Now, as I mentioned before, we have different divergent versions. I showed it already. And national committees with a multilingual background, like for instance Belgium, were aware that there were differences. And there was an increased awareness. I made a pilot project in 1996 with new translations by Bill Logan from ICOMOS Australia and Anne Magnan from ICOMOS France, who started from Anne Magnan started from the English version to translate into French, and Bill started from the French version to translate into, again, in English, and then we compared the differences. It was very, very interesting. And since there have been several articles by Claudine Houbard, I already mentioned, and Stéphane Delance, who are currently conducting a major research project on translations. Now, what linguistic version was used for the translation in Latvian, and what's the position of the Russian language? Is it closer to the English or is it closer to the French? Were there Latvians involved at the time in the beginnings of ICOMOS? Whatever the answer is, and I hope you will be able to discuss, my impression is from contacts with Latvian colleagues and works that I did with you, that the interpretation and the implementation is closer to the French version than to the English. But actually, I have no idea. Now, the next slide, please. And I'm coming to the end. Is how one of the most challenging issues, of course, in terms of the interpretation, is to understand how to deal with new interventions in old buildings. with additions and alterations for new uses and adaptive reuse. And can the principles from the Vienna Treaty help us to bring some clarity? Now, without going into detail, the design of new editions is often justified on the basis of Article 9 instead of the specific article of Article 13 for editions. And in some countries like mine, there's a marked preference for stark contrasting interventions. There's also a problem of divergent translations of Article 9, as I mentioned. And I put it on the screen. And what I wanted to show you here is that actually the English version is saying the opposite of what the French version is trying to say. It should be part of the architectural composition and not be distinct from the architectural composition. And Raymond Lemaire noted that many architects were using the Venice Charter rather to justify their projects, while they were doing the opposite of what the Charter invited them to do. The next slide, please, provides you some examples of opera house, 2 opera houses, former stock exchange in Brussels. The initial project, the waffle on the roof, has been cut, but I have not seen yet what it is in reality. And then a little church in the Czech Republic and a nice project in Belgium on housing. Next slide, please. Well, of course, there's not only the Venice Charter and the subsequent charters and guidelines provided by ICOMOS, but we now also have the European quality principles and the selection criteria that accompany them. And they were developed in response to a request by the European Commission to have a Venice Charter for decision makers. If there are any questions, your colleague Baiba was member of the drafting group. Next slide, please. So obviously the quality principles are translated into Latvian, and the selection criteria are consist of a principle, a short explanatory sentence, and then a series of questions. And this format was chosen to facilitate the debate and the dialogue, and ultimately to enhance the quality of projects. Next slide, please. There is also the initiative taken by the Swiss also during the European Year of Cultural Heritage 2018 on high quality Baukultur, and the Davos Declaration was then adopted. Its aim was to improve the quality of the daily environment. Next slide, please. The declaration was the start of a high-quality Baukultur system, which includes 8 criteria for high-quality Baukultur. It's a global approach of which cultural heritage is a significant part. Now, I'd like to stress actually that however powerful our laws or national laws are for heritage protection, you cannot ensure quality of our daily life environment without, let's say, the general planning system and the initiatives taken in terms of contemporary architecture. And again, from my experience, high-quality Baukultur is very much in line with initiatives taken in Latvia to stimulate good quality architecture. Next slide, please. So, are there any additional guidance or lessons to be learned from Paul Philippot and Raymond Lemaire? I hope that I was able to show how their humanistic approach is visible throughout the Venice Charter and beyond. But maybe there are some keywords to underscore. For them, balance and harmony was very important. They had a great sensibility, and their architectural vocabulary was larger than just contrast. Subtlety was also not a was also recognized as a quality, which doesn't mean that you can't use contrast, but you need to know when and how. Another point that was very important for them is monuments and heritage as historic evidence, and not just as an expression of identity like we often do nowadays, which can create a lot of trouble, as we are all aware of. And above all, they stressed about an in-depth knowledge of the monument. And you can only do that if you're in close contact with, let's say, with the monument itself, with the techniques that were involved, with the people that, let's say, either built it or are still taking care of it. The next slide, please. Shows two examples by Raymond Lemaire. The chapel is actually not far away from the castle I showed earlier, and the Béguinage is also one of the first complexes on a large scale that he restored, and was really a laboratory. I wanted to thank you very, very much. And I hope that you will have a lot of discussions. And I'm very sad that I could not join you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Benedict. Thank you.